Welcome to the Microsoft IT Pro Podcast, a show about Office 365, Azure, and the IT Pro and end-user side of life. Each week, we'll discuss a different topic or recent news related to Office 365 and Azure and how it relates to you as an IT Pro. The MS IT Pro Podcast is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
Good afternoon, Ben. How are you?
Wow, I'm doing well. How about yourself, Scott?
My voice has finally recovered, I think.
Mine is recovered. I'm hoping I just don't get the colds the rest of my family got this last week.
You know, one can always hope.
It is. It's a Sunday afternoon. This is a little different for us recording a podcast on a Sunday afternoon.
Right? We just ran out of time.
We had a busy week last week down in Orlando at the Live 360 conference, and you and I both spent a fair amount of time talking down there.
We were down there all week, did some sessions, did some workshops, a couple panels, things like that. And I thought it would be interesting today to talk about something that came up a whole bunch down there from attendees and other speakers and everything else. But it's kind of how you look at technology today in this world that we live in with Office 365 and potential places where you might need to do some talent realignment, or really if you just think about how our roles have changed over time, right? So you can't just be a Skype person, or you can't just be an Exchange person if you want to be a holistic practitioner, right, of kind of cloud architecture and Office 365 architecture. So thought it'd be fun to kind of talk about that and what skills folks might want to be looking into if this is an area they're interested in growing into, both from an administrative perspective, right? Because there definitely is some administrative stuff that needs to happen, but then also kind of from a higher level, call it like a senior architect or an enterprise architecture kind of role within there, right? And how we have to change and improve and get better across the board.
Exactly. This was one of those that came up in one of the panels, like you said, a few of the different sessions. It's also a conversation that I've had with some of my clients recently too. Like you said, around that concept of you and I are kind of in it, or we're in it, where we both came from kind of that SharePoint world. And as we've moved to Office 365, we've started to recognize that, hey, once you get in Office 365, if you want to, not necessarily if you want to administer it, but as you get into it, your role kind of changes. You can't stay just focused on SharePoint from an admin perspective, as some of these technologies all start getting pulled together, merged together, and have some of those interdependencies on each other.
For sure. It's a brave new world, right? So why don't we start and kind of talk administratively, right? Because there's some skill set and things that you'll probably want to start to become the jack of all trades, master of none in, right? So we tend not to go, I think in our world, maybe we don't go as deep as we'd like to, and we tend to be a little bit wider, right? Shallow across the board and then maybe deep in a couple places in there. So for instance, for someone like you and I, having started out in SharePoint land, SharePoint's a great skill to have, right? And understanding how it's constructed on the back end, from how we push site collections out, how we're going to think about things like user profiles and search and business connectivity and really kind of line of business functional kind of stuff, right? So I think that's all still applicable, and it very much comes to bear. If I understand user profiles in on-premises SharePoint, there's a couple other things that I can't do in the cloud with Microsoft's SharePoint Online service, but for the most part, it's analogous, right? Being kind of a one-to-one and being available to get out there. Where it starts to diverge a little bit is when you start to get into some of the features that the cloud stack has that on-prem doesn't, right? So there's experiences within SharePoint Online that don't exist on premises. So things like a search experience within Delve, right? Being able to kind of automatically surface information to your users, or even some of the services that are built around site collections, but they're not necessarily surfaced to admins that way. So specifically like Office 365 video, until that makes its transition to stream. Groups is that way today, and that'll be changing a little bit, right? Once it comes into the admin center and things like that. You'll have to spend some time in a couple new areas there.
Even some of those areas that if you're still still on-prem and you're looking into rolling into SharePoint Online, some of that hybrid functionality too. There's some things to be aware of, just even in terms of how it works, what's available when you start talking hybrid taxonomy, or if you start talking about things like the hybrid search or even hybrid OneDrive. There's a few different things that you can pull into that hybrid environment. And like one of our other podcasts, when we interviewed Matt McDermott on here, there's lots of different workflows. And as an admin, you have to understand maybe not all the details of it, but what's even available as you go talk to your business, as you talk to your users. What types of things can you do within hybrid to better enhance that experience for users?
Just a couple things here and there. Or you recognize what hybrid actually is in some places, right? So like, hybrid sites isn't necessarily what you think of when you say, hey, hybrid sites out of the box. Or things like Microsoft says, let's do hybrid extranets. Well, it's not really hybrid extranets, right? It's just sites that live with hybrid identity up in SharePoint Online and on the other side of the fence like that. So, yeah, I think SharePoint's kind of, again, that's an area you and I are pretty comfortable. I also think, when you grow, keeping in mind, if you want to grow into a little bit more of kind of a cross-functional role, you'll have to know some things about other workloads and other parts of the stack, right? So you'll have to know what Yammer is and how Yammer comes into play as, a service, and then how it ties into things like SharePoint, right? Like where it's sharing profile information, where it might be used as a line of business system to surface chat, like in a SharePoint site, right? Through a Yammer web part, things like that. There's a couple other kind of big pillars in there too. So you've always got Exchange and Skype looming over your head and saying, what are these services outside of more than just an entitlement, right? What's the functional impact of when I assign a license to a user and try and get them up and running within traditionally a SKU pack, right?
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, you have all those pillars. And the other aspect I would tell people to dive into, let's say you're coming from a SharePoint admin role, or from an Exchange admin role, or from that Skype for Business admin role, and you're kind of coming into this Office 365 world. The first place I would say to start is actually dive into Azure AD, because like we said on some of the other podcasts, if you get Office 365, whether you realized it or not, you have Azure because you have Azure AD, because that's that identity service underlying all of Office 365. So if you don't understand Azure AD, and how users work there, what's available there, how to administer it, even things like how to connect to it with PowerShell, you're going to be missing a lot from that administrative perspective as you move into the cloud. And again, it's not, I know when I first heard Azure AD, I think I've talked to others too that hear the same thing, and they're like, oh, AD, that's Active Directory running in the cloud. It's just like a directory server, a domain server, kind of like your typical on-prem AD servers. Well, it's not. It's a special type of Active Directory. And administering Azure AD isn't at all like administering Active Directory on-prem. So that's another one of those workloads that isn't necessarily apparent right away. But I think you really need to dive into and understand some things there, both from a core functionality perspective and how it works with Office 365, but even how other third-party services that you may start tying into Office 365, how those work with Azure AD.
You'll also have to understand licensing. Azure AD is one of those weird ones that I think throws people for a loop, right? We sit there and we say, well, I'd really like to do that conditional access thing. Well, maybe that requires some additional licensing inside of Azure AD, right? And because Azure AD is a separate service and can be licensed separately from our Office 365 tenancy, and really it might not have anything to do with like our eSKU licensing, right? Say we did E3s or E5s, but it might have something to do with enterprise mobility security. So like EMS licensing, right? Or I could just go out and buy P1s, P2s, for Azure AD and get that functionality too. So kind of understanding the impacts and what it's going to give you in the toolbox along the way. And then that bleeds down into, hey, once I understand licensing there, I better understand licensing across the other parts of that stack too, right? So what's the difference between maybe like getting an E3 and assigning a mailbox to it, or picking up a dedicated Exchange license like that E1 or E2 license, and what happens along the way should I choose to do that, right? Because typically there's going to be some functional kind of downstream impact either to a business process or a user or something else along the way.
It is. I made this comment at the conference last week. I used to say that licensing in Office 365 I thought was easier than licensing on-prem, from figuring out what you needed, what CALs you needed, what licenses you needed, all of that. I am a lot more hesitant to say that these days because, like you said, it used to just be kind of, you had those enterprise plans, you had your business plans, and there were maybe a couple other services. There just gets to be more and more different licensing options, not just for Office 365, but like you said, for Azure Active Directory, and now for Skype for Business, and even some of these newer things, Power Apps and Flow. All of the different licenses, how they all work together, what's included, what's not included. You don't want to, as a consultant, you don't want to go to a client and say, oh, you can use dynamic groups and assign licensing based on dynamic groups, or you can do all this cool stuff with conditional access. You don't want to go to your boss, to your client, and just say, oh, you guys have Office 365. This is what you can do, without really understanding, oh, maybe they can't do that because they don't have that Azure Active Directory Premium, or they don't have that EMS licensing. It's gotten really complicated for what I would consider to keep track of what's included in all those different licenses.
Just a little bit, right? And it's blurred the lines a bunch too, because you have things like on-premises usage rights, right, or user CAL for client access license for an on-premises system based on what you've licensed in Office 365. So there might be material impacts, right? If I get a SKU pack that has a SharePoint Online license, but I don't assign SharePoint Online to my users, what does that mean on-prem for that same user who might have to access a SharePoint farm there, right? Now, potentially, I might be, picking up dual CALs. Like, it just gets really, really messy, and it's kind of a quagmire to walk through, right? Easy to, avoid that pit. Oh, I avoided that one. Now I'm sinking in the sand over here as you go through and run through those systems. I think that's one of those things that, we might not like it from a system design side, or from just a pure delivery side, but you do have to know it, right? And understand, like you said, where those puzzle pieces fit together. Because if you don't, you're going to be walking around all day trying to, fit the proverbial square peg in a round hole to get everything up and running and get it to where it needs to be.
The other aspect I think you need to understand as an admin, and this is kind of where it came up a little bit more this past week, is as Microsoft keeps rolling out different features, different enhancements to that Office 365 stack, you start losing some of those definitions, some of those more pillars between products. So going back to the SharePoint example, as SharePoint admins, we understood site collections, we understood subsites, we understood how permissions worked in security, the user profile service, all of those traditional SharePoint workloads. If you were an Exchange admin, you understood mail flow, you understood transport rules, you understood the resources, your mailboxes, how to administer your mailboxes, working with shared mailboxes. If you came from that Skype admin world, again, you were familiar with the Skype server, with Skype for Business, with how to set up federation, with how to make sure clients could connect to it. But now as Microsoft rolls out things like Office 365 groups and how that interacts with the different server products, or you look at something like Microsoft Teams, where groups and teams start bringing in, okay, there's a shared mailbox and a calendar that ties into Exchange. There's the whole chat functionality, the meeting functionality. Now, the PSTN conferencing, that's part of Teams and Microsoft. And then under the covers, you have that Files tab in Teams that leverages SharePoint document libraries and folders in these SharePoint sites. You can't keep that segregation of those pillars you used to have between your Exchange team, your SharePoint team, your Skype team, because these products tie all of those different services and different aspects of those different products together into a single product. So now it's not, okay, the Skype team should manage Teams, but it's also tied into SharePoint. Or the SharePoint team should manage groups because it gets a SharePoint site, but wait a minute, it also gets an Exchange mailbox. It forces all of these teams to talk together. They need to be in a lot closer communication, a lot more collaborative than I think they used to be in the past. And kind of like you said, as an organization, you're going to want somebody that sits kind of above all of those, that understands Office 365 as a whole and how these different services that keep getting rolled out, that keep getting added, changed, how those affect all of those different teams, your Skype, your Exchange, your SharePoint, even your security team. When you get into stuff like the Security and Compliance Center, your legal team, you really do need to have at least one person that really knows Office 365 as a whole at a high level.
I mean, it becomes critical, right? So I think that scenario is a great one. So, and Teams is a great example of that. So like you said, I can't roll that workload out until I have Exchange and Skype and SharePoint licensing in place, and potentially some other things, right? Yammer entitlements and making sure that I have access to Planner and video and all the other things. So like you said, having that person who can understand organizationally where we're at and start to drive some of that strategic direction, right? And say, hey, there's this thing called Teams coming. It's going to be turned on by default. Maybe we don't want that because we're not ready because of X, Y, and Z, but let's come up with a plan and start to initiate those communications and work with your Skype team and your Exchange team to say, what is it going to take to get our users entitled for these services and allow them to live up in this world and be successful in the ways that we think they're going to need to be, right? And then I think that kind of role or that person, or whether it's one person or a team, whatever it happens to be, they have some other responsibilities as well, right? They're the ones who would be responsible for following roadmap, specifically at that high strategic level, and then maybe helping to even drive roadmap within specific workloads. So your Skype team or Skype admins might not be worried about what's happening in Skype 2 years from now, but that's going to have a material impact on your organization because you're going to be the guy that or girl that knows that Teams is going to be picking up a bunch of the functionality in Skype clients, right? So server stuff aside, you're going to have downstream client impacts to your end users as you walk through and do these. Exchange, the same kind of thing, right? Let's understand the roadmap. Yammer, let's understand the roadmap and really be able to drive some of that strategic direction. And then understand also that, typically our jobs aren't all just like strategy and drawing big boxes on whiteboards, right? It's driving practical implementation and helping do operations as well. So operations changes a little bit in this cloudy world too, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's operations. Someone asked, I think it was one of the panels, someone asked, what do you like the best about the cloud and what do you like the worst about the cloud? For me, the best part about it, I like is that I don't have to install cumulative updates. I don't have to manage the servers anymore. From that operations standpoint, a lot of that server maintenance that used to take care of the monitoring all of your servers, making sure security updates got applied, making sure cumulative updates applied, making sure it was highly available. You think of something like Exchange. If you've ever had Exchange go down for a company and your CEO can't get his email, it's not a good day. From that operations standpoint, when you were on-prem, you had to make sure Exchange was up all the time. Same thing with Skype for Business. You had a lot more stuff to think about from that operation standpoint, just in keeping servers updated, running, secure, patched, etc. As you go to the cloud, you're not worried about the servers. You're not worried about the size of your databases. You're not worried about resources on your SQL server. That whole job, that whole role, your whole job kind of shifts and changes when you start going to Office 365 and getting off those on-prem servers.
Yeah, for sure. It's, I think some people, they look at you a little bit weird when you can walk in and say, hey, like you said, your job's going to change a little bit. You're not going to be spending less time kind of across the stack, right? Your job's not going away. It's just changing in a meaningful way. So where you might have spent time supporting that highly available service on premises, well, now that I'm not maintaining servers, I need to be looking, not just to strategic roadmap, things like that, but also day to day, I need to be following up on reporting and adoption and usage. Also things like the message center, right? And understanding what are the impacts of what's coming out, because that's not even a 2-year down the road thing. That's, oh my gosh, something's leaving in 30 days. We're going to need to come up with a plan really quick and fix it, right? So that needs to be part of somebody's job, to go in and read that stuff every day. And not only read it, but understand the impact to the organization. So, and that doesn't matter if you're a 5-person company or a 50,000 person company. That needs to be something that somebody owns and picks up and really runs with, right? To go ahead and make things successful there. They also need to understand things like the service health dashboard and what that means to your tenancy specifically, right? Because your service health dashboard is a little bit different than mine, because, it's different than the next person's and different than the next person's, because we all consume different services. And then within those services, our users might be using them in different ways, right?
Right, absolutely. It kind of ties back into, I think Steve and I hit on it a little bit in our last episode of, because all of these 365 implementations are scattered around the globe, you have different users in different places, how that impacts, like you said, the reporting, making sure the service is up, because just because the service is up for me in the US doesn't mean that my users over in Europe are seeing the same thing. And one of the examples you mentioned too about keeping an eye on what's coming was Teams. This was a big one for some of my clients when all of a sudden they said that, oh, by the way, you'll be able to add Box and Dropbox and Google Drive to places you can store files within Teams, and it's going to be rolling out to your tenants in X time frame, and it's going to be on by default. I had clients saying, whoa, wait a minute, we want all of our files in SharePoint. It's your job to keep an eye on our tenant and make sure as soon as that hits our tenant, we disable it, because we don't want users storing files in Dropbox and Box and Google Drive from within Teams. So that is one of the ways your roles changes. I think to us as IT pros have to get a little bit more, we have to be more willing to talk to the business and work with the business. Part of that job may include, okay, as these different features roll out, as we get groups and teams and the video portal and stream, we're the ones keeping an eye on these. How can our business users, how can the business as a whole leverage this new functionality that we're gaining as a part of being in Office 365, as a part of what we're already licensed for? We're getting new features, new functionality all the time. How can we use this to really improve and benefit the business?
Just based on the conversation we're having, right? It might be easy for folks to say, well, that still sounds all forward looking. I think there's practical stuff in there too, right? And not that that's not practical, but it tends to be, like you said, let's look a couple weeks ahead and make sure we're ready for the button click. I think there's also things that everyone needs to be prepared to just run with in this kind of evergreen world. So one I can think of recently is we had iOS iOS 11 come out a couple months ago, right? And at the time that iOS 11 came out, it had a bug with Exchange ActiveSync. So if you were an organization that did BYOD, or you had some type of device program where your users were leveraging mail.app, right, inside of iOS, all of a sudden, they weren't going to be able to connect to their mailboxes anymore. And being able to say, all right, we know it's a problem because, hey, Microsoft told it was going to be a problem. They also offered a little bit of guidance, right? Maybe you tell your users not to upgrade, or maybe this is an opportunity to go ahead and get them up to speed in other software that's Exchange Online compatible, like Outlook for iOS, things like that, right? But being able to understand that this is the thing that happened. Here's why it's happened. Here's the functional impact to our organization, because people not being able to get their email, that tends to be a pretty big deal, right? And being able to figure all those things out, but also being that trusted advisor to be able to go, okay, so it is a problem. There's not much we can do about it because we're either waiting on Microsoft for a fix or waiting on Apple for a fix. It takes a long time to turn that SR-71 Blackbird around when it's moving at Mach whatever, flying through the air. So you can be the person who sits down and says, okay, let's all take a deep breath. So maybe this means that if we're on corporate devices, we just don't update to iOS 11 until this is fixed, right? Because we're going to have hopefully some type of managed deployment and a way to push that through. Or if we are a BYOD organization, maybe, let's make lemonade out of lemons here and teach people about Outlook and how to onboard into that, and maybe show them ways it can be a little bit better than just mail.app or calendar.app, right? Hey, did you know you can see your availability if you tie your calendar into Outlook here? And now you can do contact sync, and we know you haven't looked at it in a couple months or a year, whatever it is, things like that, right? To really be able to drive it home that the world's not ending.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It's a new environment. Like you had said, I don't think us as IT pros, and I know even me, I've been doing SharePoint consulting for, 10 years, a little over 10 years now. As Office 365 came out, I haven't felt threatened that my job of setting up SharePoint servers, installing cumulative updates, doing migrations, keeping stuff patched, I haven't felt like I'm just going to run out of work. But I have focused on, like we've been talking about, shifting that skill set, changing it to how the technology is changing, where I can still be that SharePoint admin, the Office 365 admin, but what I'm looking at, where I'm paying attention to, where I'm trying to build my skill set, just changes. It's not, you shouldn't be afraid of losing your job or losing out, having your position being eliminated because it's just not needed anymore. What's going to be required from your position is just going to be changing.
Oh, a great point. I do recognize we're coming up here at the end. We didn't have a sponsor break today. So if anyone is interested in sponsoring and getting their product or service in front of a bunch of what we think are IT pros, right? Maybe someday.
Maybe we should do a survey sometime and try to figure out who actually listens.
A group of really decent folks located all over the world, right? From the United States and the UK and Australia and Sweden and Germany and Japan, and some really awesome places in Canada and Belgium and others, right? Feel free to reach out to us, do the contact us form on the website at msclouditpro.com, and we would love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again. We really do have a good group of people that have been listening. It's been fun to see the podcast grow. So hopefully we'll continue doing it. Always love to hear from you on topics, sponsorships, whatever. So for now, thanks a lot, Scott. And we'll talk to you again next week.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben.
If you enjoyed the podcast, go leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes. It helps to get the word out so more IT pros can learn about Office 365 and Azure. If you have any questions you want us to address on the show or feedback about the show, feel free to reach out via our website, Twitter, or Facebook. Thanks again for listening and have a great day.